Hello, welcome to the Juniper Secure Connect Remote Access VPN CLI demonstration. So to begin, we'll look at the topology. In this topology, there's a few different items I want to talk about. First, we have VSRX1, which is acting as our gateway device. And connected to VSRX1, we have the internet, which is connected on interface GIGI001, and the IP address 172.18.1.1 is associated with that interface. And then we have the servers zone, which has server 1 in it, and the server IP address is 172.16.10.100, and that'll be important, so keep that in mind, as we'll be accessing that server from the remote worker that you see up top connected to the internet. And then one last thing to talk about in the server zone is the interface GIGI000 has an IP address of 172.16.10.1. We will be source netting traffic from the remote worker that is using the Juniper Secure Connect application to that IP address, so server 1 knows how to get back to that remote worker. And that might seem a little strange, so I'll explain that as we go, so don't worry too much about that right now if it seems a little weird. And then we have the GIGI002 interface of VSRX1, and that has the IP address of 192.168.1.1, and that connects into the user's zone. Okay, so what do we want to do with this? We have the remote worker who needs to access server 1 for a web-based application. And they need to do that when they're working from home. We are going to use Juniper Secure Connect to provide that access. And then we also do not want to allow access to anything in the user zone. There's no reason for the remote worker to access anything in that zone, and we only want to provide access to server 1 or something in the server's zone. There might be additional servers in there or whatever, so just keep that in mind. And so the next thing we want to make sure we do is that the remote worker only sends traffic through the tunnel that is destined to server 1 or something in the server's zone. If that remote worker is, say, watching a YouTube video or something else, we don't want that traffic going through our VPN. That's very important because in today's world where a lot of people are working remotely, you don't want to overwhelm VSRX1 with traffic that isn't work related, or at least traffic that doesn't need to go through the VPN. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and jump to the CLI of VSRX1 and get this going. All right, so here is VSRX1. The first thing we need to do is create the certificate, the PKI certificate that we will be using for this Juniper Secure Connect Remote Access VPN. So first thing we need to do is we use the request security PKI generate key pair size. We'll say 2048 bits. Type, we're going to use an RSA. And the certificate ID, we're going to name it here. We're going to name this JSC. And that's for Juniper Secure Connect. And you can see that it was generated. And we can see the key size. So that's good. And now we need to sign the certificate. Press security, we're just going to locally sign it. Specify local certificate. Generate, self-signed. I'm going to specify that certificate name we just created. And we're going to specify the subject. Now we're going to specify the subject here. Say juniper.net. If I can type. And then we're going to finish it off with the common name of edu. Then we're going to specify a domain name. Now this is very important that we get this right, and I'll explain why. Now what will happen when we connect to the Juniper Secure Connect Remote Access VPN from the remote worker? We'll need to specify the gateway address, and it'll be a URL. And this URL needs to match what's in the certificate for the domain name. If it doesn't, then we're going to have a failure. It's just not going to work because their certificate's not going to match the information that is provided. And so we need to make sure that we specify that correctly and then we use it correctly. Because what's going to happen is we're going to specify a gateway address that is going to be for jsc.edu, and then that address will resolve with a DNS request to the actual IP address associated with the external interface on VSRX1. Now, something else we could do, we could specify an IP address, and then we could use that as the gateway address. And so you can do that as well. So if we specified an IP address and specified the external IP address of VSRX1, we could use either or. But with what we're doing here, we're just going to stick with the domain name. And as you can see here, the self-signed certificate was generated and loaded successfully. So let's look at that certificate. You can see here, everything looks pretty good. It's valid for 5 years. We can see that we're using RSA encryption, 2048 bits. And so that certificate looks like it's ready to use. So let's go ahead and jump into configuration mode And let's configure the web management to use this certificate. So set system services web management HTTPS PKI local certificate, and we specify that certificate ID. And so we're done with that. And the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to create that Source Nat Rule. Recall in the topology, when we were looking at, I talked about a Source Nat Rule and that we needed to configure one, because what happens here is we're going to, and you'll see this later, we're going to assign an address pool for anyone connecting into the VPN. And it'll be an address that isn't on our network. And so what happens there, or the problem that can happen there, is if we don't do anything special here, when the remote worker attempts to access server 1, that traffic will get sent to server 1, and then that server will want to respond to that traffic, and it doesn't really know what to do with the traffic, so it sends it to its default gateway, which is VSRX1, and then VSRX1 will then send it out towards its default gateway, which is obviously not what we want. So we can solve this problem one of two ways. We can create a static route that says for that traffic, which in our case it's going to be the 10.77.77/24 network, send that traffic to the ST0 interface. You can do it that way, or you can create a source NAT rule that says when that traffic comes in, source NAT it to the outgoing interface, which in our case is going to be the server's interface on VSRX1. So that's going to be Gigi001, I believe. And source NAT it to that interface. So when the server responds, it'll respond to the IP address of that interface, and then reverse source NAT will stuff it into the ST0 tunnel. And so that's a really good way to get around that problem. So we're going to configure NAT, source NAT that is. And we're going to say from zone, because it's going to be coming in from the VPN zone. And then we're going to say to zone, and it's going to be going towards the server's zone. Then we need to configure a rule. We'll say, let's call this rule whatever. Match source address anything. And then source NAT interface. And that'll take care of that VPN traffic, that return VPN traffic. And so just as a quick verification to make sure we did this right, let's look at the security zones, the server security zones, and we can see that actually that Gigi00 interface. I misspoke earlier and said Gigi001, couldn't remember off the top of my head, but that is going to be going out that Gigi00 interface. And so let's look at that interface. And we can see here it's going to be NATed to that 172.16.10.1 address. And the server, that is server 1, will know how to get to that address. So it's really easy for server 1 and VSRX to figure out what to do with that return traffic. And so the next thing we want to do is we want to configure some security policies to allow this traffic. And before we actually do that, we need to configure an address book entry for server 1. So we'll go to the global address book. We'll specify the servers, because this will be the server's network, because we might add a server later. You never know. And we'll say 172.16.10.0/24 for that address block. And then we need to configure the actual policies. And we'll say from zone servers to zone VPN. Policy RA-JSC-VPN-1. Just to name the policy something. We'll say match source address. We'll say servers. And so this is because it's from servers to the VPN. So we want to say it's coming from the server's network. And the destination address, we'll say any application, any as well. Then we'll set then permit edit from zone VPN to zone servers policy. We'll just call this RA-JSC-VPN-2. We'll set a match source address, any destination address, we'll say servers, because it's coming from the VPN to the servers. So source of anything going to the destination of servers. An application, we're just going to put that in any. Permit the traffic. We'll show those security policies. You can see here the first policy we configured from servers to zone VPN, policy RA-JSC-VPN-1. We see it's coming from servers, going to anything, and we're permitting it. And then the next policy, it's coming from anything and going to servers, and we're permitting it. And then we need to configure some security zone information. We need to look at the untrust zone, because it's very important we allow the correct traffic here. You could simply say all system services, but you really don't want to do that on an external facing interface. For security reasons, you don't want to allow everything and possibly open yourself up to an attack. You only want to allow the services you need. So we'll say set host inbound traffic, system services. We need Ike, and then we need TCP and CAP, and then we also need HTTPS. Those are the three. And that's all you need for that. Then we do need to configure that secure tunnel VPN interface. So set interface is ST0, unit 0, family INET. We do not need to add an IP address here since this is a remote access VPN. It's unnecessary to add an actual IP address. You can, it wouldn't hurt anything, but it's unnecessary, so I'm not going to do it. And then we need to configure the VPN security zone with that interface. You can see in the VPN zone, it now has the ST0 interface. Now, something that's interesting here, notice how we do not enable any sort of host inbound traffic here. And it's because we don't need to. Traffic will not be going directly to the ST0 interface. We'll be using that ST0 interface to facilitate VPN traffic, but it'll be passing through the ST0 interface. So there's no reason to add any sort of host inbound traffic here. And there's no IP address associated with the ST0 interface, so there's no reason to even add something like ping for the host inbound traffic, because you can't ping it if there's no IP address, right? Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead and configure the access configuration parameters. And we need to configure an address assignment pool. We'll call this RA-JSC-pool. And we're going to be configuring INET, family INET parameters. Set the network to 10.77.77.0/24. And I got an extra space in there. All right, that looks better. And we'll set the range. So this is the IP addresses we're going to be handing out from that network. And we need to call it something. Call this JSC-range. We need to set the low range and the high range. And you might ask, well, why not just do the full range? And that would work perfectly fine, but you may not want to do this if, say, you have a server or something else in your network that could be using that IP address. We don't in this instance, but it doesn't hurt just to limit us to 50 IP addresses. We definitely will not have more than 50 workers or remote workers connecting in with this demo, but it just depends on how many remote workers you will have. And you could set that to whatever you want. You can set to use the full range, or you can set to use even a bigger range if you want to by changing that network to, I don't know, something like a /16. Then you'd have a lot of IP addresses if you want to. And then we need to at least set some XAuth attributes. We need to set the primary DNS. And so that is the minimum we need there. And then we need to configure the access profile. So let's configure the actual profile. We need to name it. We'll call this RA-JSC-access. We'll set, now this is where we set our credentials for our clients. We're going to use lab because that's just what we do here. We use lab as the username a lot. And then we need to set the actual password. And we say firewall user password. I'm going to use lab123. So this is the credential for the remote worker to use. This is what the remote worker will enter when prompted for a username and password. Now, something to point out here is we're using local authentication. You can set up to use radius authentication or some other type of AAA authentication as well. But for this demonstration, we're simply just using local authentication. And this works really great if you don't have a ton of remote workers. Say you have 50 remote workers, you could easily set up 50 users here and not have to add in more complication with the configuration. And we need to specify the address pool that we just configured. You can see the configuration thus far. And then next we need to configure the firewall authentication parameters. So set firewall authentication, web authentication, and we need to specify that profile we just created. And then next, let's configure the services SSL termination profile. Give it a name. And this will reference that certificate that we created earlier. And then we'll configure the TCP encapsulation profile. And that'll reference that SSL termination profile. And so with that configuration, we can move on to configuring the IKE parameters. And there's quite a bit, so I'll walk through them with you. First, we need to configure the IKE proposal and policy. We need to name this. We'll just call this JSC-VPN-Pro, short for proposal. We need to set the authentication method. We're going to use pre-shared keys. Now, you don't have to use pre-shared keys here, but for this demonstration, it's easy to use those pre-shared keys. We'll say DH group 19 for Diffie-Hellman group. Set authentication algorithm. Set that. We can use SHA-256. And then the encryption algorithm, we'll use AES 256 CBC. And then we can configure the policy. Call this RA-JSC-VPN-POL, short for policy. We need to set the mode to aggressive. And that is that way for any remote access VPN. We set that to aggressive instead of main mode. And then we say proposal. Specify that proposal we just did. And pre-shared key, ASCII text. And we're going to set that to Juniper 123. Now, this password here, you do not hand out to the user. They do not need to use this password. We need to configure the gateway after this. And then we need to reference the IKE policy. You need to set the dynamic parameters. Set the host name we're going to be using here. It's going to be an email address. Again, the remote user, the remote worker, does not need to know this address. We need to set the user type, the IKE user type, to shared IKE ID. And then we can configure optionally some dead peer detection parameters. We don't really need to do this, but it's kind of good to have. I think dead peer detection is very useful. And we'll set the interval to 10 and the threshold to 5. And then set the external interface to gigi-0/0/1. That is the interface that is in the untrust zone. So that is the interface on VSRX1 that is pointed towards the internet. And we set the local address to the IP address that is associated with that external interface. Then we need to reference the access profile that we created earlier. And then set the version to v1 only. And then reference that TCP encapsulation profile. And then we can configure the IPsec parameters. Configure the proposal first. Protocol to ESP and the encryption algorithm to AES 256 GCM. And then we need to configure the policy. We'll set the perfect forwarding secrecy to use keys for Diffie-Hellman group 19. And then we'll also set the policy to use that proposal we just created. And then we need to configure the VPN. Then we set the bind interface to ST0. Remember, we created that earlier. We can use the DF bit clear. That's useful in case there's some fragmentation going on. We want to be able to fragment the traffic and not just drop it. So we're going to clear that do not fragment bit. Then we're going to set the IKE parameters, the stuff we just configured, and the IPsec policy. And then we need to configure a traffic selector. And what we're doing here, recall that when we were talking in the topology section that we wanted to only allow traffic, or rather we want to only enable traffic destined for the server subnet through the tunnel. And so this is how we do that. This is how we do that split tunneling. So if that remote worker pulls up a YouTube video, work related or not, then that YouTube traffic will not go through the tunnel because we want to avoid overhead like that going through our VSRX device. And so with that, we need to, for the local IP, specify the subnet for the servers, and the remote IP, we're going to set that to all zeros. And so you can see the configuration there for the IPsec VPN. And then lastly, we need to configure the remote access configuration. So we'll go to remote access, security remote access, that is, in the configuration. And we need to configure the client configuration. And we need to set the connection mode to manual. And then we can set some dead peer detection parameters, interval 60, threshold 5. And then we need to configure the remote access profile. And here we reference the IPsec VPN that we configured. And then we reference the access profile. And then we reference the client config that we created a few seconds ago. And then we need to set the default profile as well. And that is the profile that we just created a couple seconds ago for the remote access configuration. And we're done with that. So I'm going to commit and quit the configuration here to jump out of configuration mode. And now that that configuration committed successfully, let's go ahead and jump to the remote worker device and see how this works. All right, so here is the remote worker device. Before we try to connect with Juniper Secure Connect, let's go ahead and open a web browser and see what happens when we try to access that internal resource. And so the web browser loads up and you can see it connects to juniper.net, no problem. So we definitely have internet access with the remote worker. So that's great. We need internet access to be able to get to the VSRX device. And so let's go ahead and click on this bookmark, which is the internal IP address for that server. And you can see here that we're just kind of spinning. We're actually not accessing it. And that's great. We don't want to be able to access that resource unless we're connecting to the Juniper Secure Connect VPN. And so with that, we could just wait here and we'd see the timeout, but let's go ahead and shrink this web browser and then attempt to connect with the Juniper Secure Connect client. And so recall that we need to use that domain name we specified in the certificate, and that's going to be in the gateway address field here. And so recall that is jcs.edu. So enter that here in the gateway address, click the connection button, and then we're prompted for the user ID and password. Recall that's lab123 for the user ID and password. Let's click OK. You can see I made a mistake here. Look at this. It says HTTP request failed, could not resolve host HTTP. We want to change that to HTTPS. This has to be an HTTPS protocol here. And so we change that and let's click connect again and enter the username and password. And this looks better. We have the security certificate pop up and it shows up as a potential security risk. And why is that? Well, that's because that's something we just generated locally. It's not something that is a trusted certificate out there in the world. And so you're going to get this error. And that's okay. That's not a problem to get this because we know that it is okay because we created it. And so one thing I want to point out here is in the DNS section right here, you see that we're using jsc.edu. That's what we want to have match with our gateway address. And so since that's matching, things are going to be good. So let's go ahead and accept the certificate. And once we accept this, the user won't have to accept it again when they connect to the VPN a second time and third and so forth. So let's go ahead and accept it. And you can see here that the client changes, shows that we're going through different steps. The tunnel is set up and now we're just authenticating the user and it shows connection established. And then it minimizes it because you probably don't need that up if you're a normal user. So I'm going to get that back up and you can see here that we have connection established. The tunnel is green. All three icons below are green. We see leaks established successfully on the far left one. The authentication successful. And then encryption is active. So that's great. And then we have other statistics, the time online, data sent and received in bytes, and it'll show kilobytes once we get more than 1,000 bytes. And then the speed in kilobytes. And then timeout, direction, link type, as well as the encryption we're using here. And so this looks perfect. So let's go ahead and go back to that web browser and see what happens when we try to connect to that internal resource. And so here's the web browser, and it will auto refresh like it just did, and it shows that we're connected. We see welcome to the IJSEC Juniper Secure Connect website. Perfect, simple web page, but we can get to it. So the user is able to access this resource. So let's go ahead and shrink that, and I want to open a PowerShell window and show you a few different things as we do this. Let me move this around a little bit. Let me shrink this. We don't need this full size, so we can get everything on screen at the same time. Okay, so notice how in the data sent and received, we have kilobytes. It's almost symmetrical. That's because that website is not a lot to it, very simple. And so that's fine. That's not bad. In a normal situation, it would be not so symmetrical. And so with that, let's go ahead and I want to show you if we ping that server, we'll see that, the speed that we're seeing here, as well as the sent and receive rate incrementing. And so, okay, great. We're sending that through the tunnel. That's exactly what we want to do. But what happens if we try to send some internet-bound traffic through the tunnel? So let's ping just www.juniper.net and see what happens. And we can reach it great. And notice how the sent and received bytes are not incrementing. That's perfect. That's what we want to see because we don't want this traffic going through the tunnel. The speed shows 0. That's perfect as well. And one last thing I want to point out is if you're having problems with this, you can look at the log files in the client here. Select Help, then Logbook, like what I showed there, and you'll get all the information about what's happening. And it'll give you the information, like if we scroll up here, you'll see that we had the HTTP request failed. We had a problem with getting certificate and whatnot. That's because we were using HTTP instead of HTTPS. So you can go through here and find out what is going on if there is a problem. So let's go ahead and cancel that ping and send traffic in a ping to the server again. So we're going to have that running, and we can see traffic is going through the tunnel again. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump back to VSRX1 and have a look at things. Okay, so here is VSRX1. First, let's look at the security associations for IKE. And we can see we have one security association that is up, and that's our remote worker. That's perfect. And then let's do the show security IPsec security associations. And we have security associations for that as well. And so it's perfect. The tunnel's up and it's functioning. We already knew that, but it is good to verify it here. And say you do have some problems, you can come here and look at things as well to try to figure out what's going on. Then the last thing I want to look at is the session table for that traffic we're sending through right now. And you can see we're sending the traffic. We can see that we are coming in on 10.77.77.1. Perfect. That's what we expected. That's that first IP address in that range. And we're handing that out. And we're sending the traffic to 172.16.10.100. That's our server. Perfect again. And then the server, which is 172.16.10.100, is sending traffic to the 172.16.10.1 address. And if you remember, that's because we have Source Nat enabled. And so we have this traffic coming in, source from the 10.77.77.1 address, going to the server, so the remote worker to the server, and then the server responds to that natted address. So we're netting that traffic to the 172.16.10.1 address, the source NAT that is, so the 10.77.77.1 is being natted to the 172.16.10.1 address, and so that allows the server to respond to it because the server knows how to get to that address. It's on its network, so it responds to it, and then reverse source NAT will then put that traffic back into the tunnel because it sends it towards the ST0 tunnel interface. So that does bring us to the end of this demonstration. As always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Network's certification program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.